like to introduce, ladies and gentlemen, the 26th President of the United States, Mr. Theodore Roosevelt. Mr. President.
Delighted to be here and have so many of you join us at Sagamore Hill on the 248th celebration of our nation's independence. This is delightful to see so many good Americans here celebrating on a day that we should be proud of as Americans. This is our national birthday of independence. And to my British friends in the audience, why aren't you at work? Well, as I said, this is the Roosevelt family home. On behalf of the Roosevelt family, I welcome you to Sagamore Hill. But as you may be aware of, it's no longer the Roosevelt family home. It is your home. And as Superintendent Parker so eloquently said, this home belongs now to all of you American citizens as your national birthright. My younger cousin, Franklin, when he was president of the United States, signed legislation, the National Historics Act, that made sites of historical significance, like Sagamore Hill, part of our National Park Service. So Sagamore Hill today is now managed under the capable hands of the National Park Service. People like Superintendent Parker and all of our wonderful rangers, these workaday folks in the National Park Service who care for these sites. Bully for the National Park Service. And I want to thank also this association, again, that grew up in my memory and honor, the Theodore Roosevelt Association. And thank you for being a part of this. And thank you to the Friends of Sagamore Hill who put in those countless hours toiling away to make sure that this old homestead remains visitable by the public. Sagamore Hill was a very special place for the Roosevelt family. It was our home, and you may know that I had some jobs that took me away from the area from time to time, whether it was the governor's office in Albany or whether it was the War Department as Assistant Secretary of the Navy or Civil Service Commissioner in the nation's capital, and even Vice President and eventually President of the United States, spending that 7.5 glorious years in the White House. And I think no family enjoyed the White House as much as the Roosevelts did. But this, Sagamore Hill, was always home to come back to. This was home for the Roosevelt family. We had a bully time living, did we not, Quentin? We had a bully time living in this home, on this homestead. This was a place like you can experience today, and it warmed my heart to see so many young families experiencing the grounds of Sagamore Hill, playing the games out in the yard, having a wholesome American family time together. It warms my heart to see this place being used for such American wholesome activities that supports the family unit, which is the heart of citizenship in this country. So the Roosevelt family, again, the grounds that you see here have grown up a little bit with the trees, but we had a working farm on the property, as you have probably determined. The Roosevelt family enjoyed a great many games on the property, most of which had to do with the great outdoors. We played We played a number of games on the property. One of my favorites was one you may have heard of called Point to Point, where you start as a group and you pick a point off in the far distance and you march Indian style off towards that point. And there's very few rules to such a game the only rule really is that when you encounter an obstacle, that you must go over it, through it, under it, never around it. That would be disgraceful. So I encourage you, while you're on the grounds here, to do a bit of point to point. And in my time, that meant that when you encountered a slough down here, such as the swampy area, it meant that you waded through it in your clothes. You didn't bother changing. You were always, if you came to Sagamore Hill as a visitor, you must know that you were going to be initiated into the Roosevelt family homestead by this point-to-point game. That you would get dirty, and you would wade through the slough, and then if you encountered a pond, then it meant swimming across that pond in your clothes. If you encountered a tree, it meant climbing it, or a fence, it meant mounting the fence. A haystack on the property meant that you had to either surmount it in some way, traveling over it or through it, but never around it. This was bully fun. I thought it was bully fun, at least. But we had a number of children on the property in addition to the 6 Roosevelt children. There were Roosevelt cousins in the area and some of their friends. So we may have 15 to 20 little Roosevelts running around, little oysters on the property, participating in this game. And I heard through the grapevine one day of this young little Roosevelt cousin who returned home with her dress torn and all filthy and covered in mud, and she says to her mother, who was scolding her for coming home in such a disgraceful state, "Well, Cousin Theodore was leading us." And the mother apparently says, "Just because your cousin Theodore sets the bad example doesn't mean you should also." This is what I had to deal with in the Roosevelt family. We had a number of bully games on the 4th of July that, again, reminded me of my own children's fun on the 4th of July. It was always a time of family fun. We had fried chicken, we had watermelon. This was the food that I always looked forward to in the summer at Sagamore Hill. We had games out in the yard, running races, 3-legged races, and we had fireworks. And I was the chief administrator of the fireworks, the supervisor of the children's games that day. And we had our sprinklers and our Roman candles at night, and we had firecrackers. Now, we haven't handed out firecrackers to my knowledge today, although that probably would have been appropriate. But Superintendent, can you confirm that we have no firecrackers?
I cannot confirm that.
Okay, we cannot just right. So it started under the watch of Kermit when he came home from Groton School, and he had some of his friends with him, and he drug along all the younger Roosevelt boys and cousins with him, and started an unfortunate tradition of, in the wee morning hours of the 4th of July, that they decided that the neighborhood needed a bit more celebration, and they took their firecrackers and they set off firecrackers at the front doorsteps of the neighboring properties. And the boys apparently believed that they were untouchable, that they were beyond the reach of the law, as it were, because they were operating out of the president's house. But from time to time, word would get back to me that my sons had been involved in some shenanigans, and it was necessary for me to extend a presidential pardon, as it were, to the boys and get them out of trouble. But this was how we celebrated the 4th of July. And it was always a bully day. And it was a day that we felt like we were Americans celebrating our nation's gift of independence, of liberty, and justice for all in a self-governing republic. What a gift that our forefathers have gifted us, that we are heirs to this self-governing tradition. And the Roosevelt children grew up with this understanding that citizenship is the true test of a citizen's worth. That service is the true test of a citizen's worth. And the Roosevelt children who grew up here understood that were it time to answer the nation's call for service, that they would not be spared simply because they were members of the president's family. More importantly, it was important for the Roosevelt children to set the example to the nation for service. So when the storm clouds began to rise in Europe in 1914, we believed at the Roosevelt House here that it was only a matter of time before America would be dragged into the conflict, and the Roosevelt children understood that they would not be spared, that they would follow my example of military service when the nation's time called. Even though I was a father of 6, I went off to the Spanish-American War in Cuba and fought against the Spanish lines, leading our Rough Riding Regiment up the San Juan Hill ridgeline. I believed then, as I believe now, that no man who lived a life of ease ever left a name worth remembering. And I was determined to leave the Roosevelt children a name worth remembering. And I passed on that legacy of service, I believe, to the Roosevelt children. When storm clouds rose, one by one, the Roosevelt children entered the nation's great war in Europe in 1917. One at a time, each one of the boys, and even Ethel, my youngest daughter, was the first to see the industrialized warfare of the European theater as a nurse with her husband, Richard Derby, serving in an Allied French hospital in the first year of the war. And it's from her reports, of all people, that I received some of the first indications of how dreadful this industrialized warfare was going to be. This wasn't going to be another horse and cavalry charge of my generation. And my boys understood this as well. And again, one at a time, we watched them leave. And the last to go was Quentin, our youngest. And Quentin was always incredibly interested in things mechanical, and always tinkering with machines and trying to fix a vehicle up so he could drive around the area, and taking the keys out of my hands, working on the engine of cars. And so it was no surprise then that he would be interested in joining this new air service in the American Expeditionary Force, and would want to pilot one of these new fangled prop-driven aircraft. And so naturally, he was inclined to become a fighter pilot in the European theater. And it was here, just down the road in Mineola, that he trained at the Mineola airfield. And I would come out each day, and I would hear his prop-driven plane approaching the Roosevelt homestead, and he would fly over the property, and I would come out onto the veranda right here, and I would look up, and I would wave at Quentin. "Hello, Quentin!" And he would buzz around the property and do circles, and then head over to his fiancée's property and look very militaristic, flying over, I suppose, dropping love letters over her property. I don't know. I've never inquired, Quentin. But this was the excitement of the time. Every Roosevelt boy couldn't wait to get into the action, to put their lives in harm's way, because that was the Roosevelt way. So you can imagine the pride of Edith and I as we put him onto the troop ship down in New York City, and we bade farewell to Quentin. It was July of 1917. And how proud we were to see Quentin sail off to his war in his own crowded hour in the Great War. Ladies and gentlemen, would you give a round of applause for my son, the youngest of the Lion's Pride, Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt.
Welcome to Sagamore Hill. These woods, these plains, and these coulees were my home. And it is wonderful to have you all here today. I haven't been back in a while. My sister-in-law was asked about her first stay at Sagamore Hill. She said, "It was absolute madness. Nothing in my upbringing could have prepared me for such a thing." She said that at every moment of all day, there was something going on. Someone was playing a game, someone was visiting, and someone was climbing a tree. At midnight, she thought that it would have ended hours before. And at midnight, everyone would retire to their rooms. At this moment of silence, she had a moment of peace, which was suddenly broken by the sound of everyone remembering that story or vignette that they had forgotten to tell everyone during the day, and everyone ran out into the hall screaming at the top of their lungs. After a very short sleep, it all began at 6 a.m. again. And it was a wonderful place to grow up. I recall another time my older brother Ted Jr. received a new rifle as a gift. And he thought he would take it and shoot it. And he went down to the beach where we had a beach house. And he put his target against the wall of the beach house. And he fired away his gun, and his gun was almost as loud as that motorcycle. Unbeknownst, the bullets had gone through the beach house and through my father's swimming suit. Later in the week, my father and my mother and some of their friends took a swim, and he turned around to grab something out of his bag, and he revealed far too much president. Wonderful times here. I recall 124 years ago today. It was July 4th, 1900. My father had just been nominated to be Vice President of the United States, Republican nomination. He was on his way home. We children very much wanted to shoot off our fireworks, but we had to wait for Father. We went into the barn, gathered our fireworks, brought them to the house. My mother said there was enough gunpowder to blow the house into the bay. And out from the northwest, a storm cloud began to blow in, and it threatened the success of our events. We were afraid that we were going to get rained out that night. And fortunately, the storm blew away. At around 6 p.m., my father was in this house with reporters, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the rain is going to save the house from fire and explosion." But he said, as for the children, we'll have to trust in Providence. Fortunately, no Roosevelt children were harmed that night. 8 p.m., we began lighting into the night, and Sagamore Hill was covered with lanterns and fireworks. It was a wonderful place to grow up. I also grew up in the White House, however. Many of my escapades in the White House are told as in Washington, D.C. and New York newspapers, where we were given the name the White House Gang. I'm sure you can come across many of those stories. A president, however, cannot live in the White House for forever. My cousin Franklin tried. We moved out in 1909, and where I continued education at Groton Preparatory School, where I excelled. And then in 1915, I enrolled in Harvard College. It was not yet a university. While I was at Harvard, I was very aware of the conflict that was raging across the sea. To prepare for entrance into the conflict, I was in the Harvard ROTC, and I spent my summers in military preparedness camps. On April 7th, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson was addressing Congress with a declaration of war. I, that day, addressed my dean with a request for leave of absence. I was not to remain studying books at Harvard College while my brothers and compatriots fought. As Father told you earlier, I very much love aviation, and I'm loving these airplanes today. I don't know about you. They're a little faster than my airplane. But I wanted to be a fighter pilot. Inheriting my father's bad eyesight, I had to memorize the eye chart. I was admitted into flight school, and I trained in Mineola, very close to here. After the war, the field in which I trained was renamed to Roosevelt Field, and now you can go and see Roosevelt Field Shopping Center. That is where I trained. I much preferred it there when there were planes rather than purses, I might tell you. About 10 years after I trained there, a certain Charles Lindbergh made the first transatlantic flight across, and he landed in Paris, but he started at Roosevelt Field, my namesake. On my last night in this house, in June of 1917, I was laying in my bed, and I heard the door open, and it was my mother. She had come to tuck me in. Even though I was a soldier going off to war, And even though I was 19 years old, and even though I was a fighter pilot, I was still her baby. On the troop ship, she slipped bread and treats into my bag. Unfortunately, we would never meet again. When I landed in Europe, Europe was a deadly and changed place. All the women walked around the streets in Paris with a gaunt look in their eye. The men were either wearing a military uniform or were missing a limb, an eye, or the morale. I was initially assigned to be a supply officer. This was very frustrating. I wanted a front lines position. That's why I'd gone to Europe. I did not go to Europe to supply the front lines. I went to Europe to fight on the front lines. And after 12 months in Europe, I was finally given a front lines position. When I arrived on the front lines, it was a deadly place. The Germans had been flying since 1914, 1915, and we pilots were new to combat. The Germans had superior aircraft. We were flying the Newport 28, the plane the Frenchmen would not fly. It was the objective of the Wilson administration to send the men over and then the supplies. We were left at the mercy of what supplies we could find. I was often left going across French countryside to find supplies on a motorcycle. I would commandeer it. Friends, a commandeer is a synonym for steal. I can recall my first patrol in enemy territory. I was flying about with 2 other American pilots, and a large piece of shrapnel ripped through my wing. If it had gone through my fuselage or me, it would have been the end of my life. I recall on another occasion, when a faulty engine left, I drew away from formation. I was left vulnerable and alone, and suddenly a shadow flashed across my fuselage. And I looked up. To my terror, it was a German pilot. In flight school, we were taught the saying, beware the Hun and the sun. Oftentimes, pilots would hide within the sun's rays and dive out at you because you cannot look directly in the rays of the sun. Fortunately, he must not have seen me because he continued along in his flight path. I was not always the victim and the hunted in World War I. I could recall on another patrol, I was with 2 other Americans, and we were flying about our sector. But again, I found myself separated. This time I cannot blame a faulty engine, perhaps a short attention span. I looked off in the distance after a half hour of flying, and instead of turning around, I thought I'd fly around and look around a bit. I had a full tank of gas. It's not like there's a war on. I went off, and in another half hour passed. In the distance, I saw 2 aircraft, and I assumed that they were Americans, for they did not try and attack me. I put my plane to full speed, and slowly the distance between us began to decrease. When I was nearly in formation, the rear man shifted in his flight path, and to my terror, printed on his tail was a black German cross. I was outnumbered. There were 3 of them. I was outgunned. I was deep within enemy territory. But they hadn't seen me yet, so I thought I might try a shot. I put my sights upon the rear man. I squeezed the trigger. I saw him burst to flames, and he went in a great black spiral down to the earth. I'd had my crowded hour, and I had claimed a victory. But I did not have long to celebrate, for there were 2 hungry Germans swirling around at me. They chased me for 20 kilometers back to American lines. It was the longest 20 kilometers of my life. I wrote my family a letter rejoicing about my victory. 4 days later was Bastille Day. Bastille Day is the French equivalent of Independence Day. In order to celebrate, as we are doing now, my commanding officer assigned me to organize the day's celebration. I got together a ragtime band. Frenchmen, to this day, are very fond of American ragtime music. We went on patrol. We were supposed to be back at base by noon. However, at noon, 12:15, 12:30, no one knew where I was. What had happened is, as I was going out about patrol, flying around, looking for the Hun, with 2 other Americans, and suddenly we were swarmed by 7 Germans. They were everywhere. At one point, I had two in my tail at the same time. I swerved to the left and to the right. I fired my gun when I could. But suddenly, my life was over.
It was here on this veranda that I received the dreadful news that Quentin had been killed in aerial combat over northern France in July of 1918. It's a very somber thing for a father to know that the war that I had so strenuously advocated had led to the death of my youngest son, my dear Quentin. My wife Edith, who was so brave in the weeks and the months after Quentin's death, remarked that you cannot raise a boy to be an eagle and then expect him to behave as a sparrow. Quentin paid with his body for his soul's desire. It's a dreadful thing to see the fine and young gallant youth stricken down in the golden morning of their life. But Quentin died as the heroes of old had died. As brave and fearless men have always risked their lives when a great cause calls. If our country did not contain such men, it would not be our country.